Nobody on the lot would give $65 for the old roll-top desk with the drawer that wouldn't open, so when the tall old man raised one finger, a heavy-set estate dealer named Lyle Cruz laughed loud enough to turn the whole crowd around. Silas Penhallow did not turn with them. He kept his pale eyes on the desk and let the laugh roll off his back the way rain rolls off oilcloth. And when the auctioneer said sold, he nodded once and went to count out his money. It was a bright, wind-scoured Saturday morning, the 12th of March, 1983, at the Dewberry Farmstead dispersal sale on a section line road 3 miles outside Cedar Bluff, Nebraska. The old Dewberry place was being sold off down to the fence wire. The family gone to the city, the buildings leaning. And what was left of 4 generations stood out in the cold March wind on hay wagons and trestle tables for the neighbors to pick over. Cream separators and harness and crocks, a treadle sewing machine, and an oak roll-top desk, its timbre cracked and stuck halfway, its finish alligatored, with one deep-file drawer on the bottom right that was locked and would not open and had no key. Silas was 69 years old. He stood 6'2" and was thin as a fence post, all knuckle and tendon, stooped a little now at the top from a life bent over other men's broken machinery. He had a long, clean-shaven face going hollow in the cheeks, a full head of fine white hair, pale gray eyes set deep under white brows, and the deep-scored crow's feet of a man who had squinted into 60 Nebraska summers. He wore a faded blue denim chore coat over a red and black checked flannel shirt, brown corduroy trousers, and lace-up work boots cracked across the toe. On his head was a sweat-stained tan felt hat with a braided horsehair band, and in his pocket was a bone-handled folding knife his own grandfather had carried. His hands were long and spotted and stutty. $65, Lyle Cruz crowed, working the crowd. $65 for a desk you can't write at, with a drawer you can't open. Hope there's gold in it, Silas, 'cause that's the only way you didn't just light $65 on fire. Cruz was past 40 and going to fat, ruddy in the face, his thin red hair slicked back over a sunburned scalp. He wore a green quilted vest over a yellow western shirt with pearl snaps, pressed khakis, and ostrich skin boots he was careful to keep on the dry grass. He had a clipboard under his arm and a way of pricing a dead family's whole life in the time it took to walk past it. Silas had been a fix-it man his whole life, a hired hand in his youth, and then, for 50 years, the man the county called when a baler jammed or a windmill froze or a wagon needed its iron reset. He had never owned much, but he had opened more stuck and rusted and seized up things than any man in 3 counties, and he knew that a drawer of family kept locked through a dispersal sale. A drawer they would rather sell with the secret still in it than open and explain was a drawer with a reason. He paid his $65 to the clerk, signed Penhallow in a spidery careful hand, and loaded the desk alone into his truck, waving off the young men who offered, because he had loaded heavier things than that at his age and meant to keep doing it as long as he could. A woman watched him do it from beside the wagon of crockery, an old woman in a man's barn coat with a wool scarf knotted under her chin, and when he had the desk settled, she came over slow on a cane. Her name was Hetty Lund, and she had been born on the section line and buried a husband and 2 sons on it, and knew everything there was to know about everyone who had ever farmed within 10 miles of Cedar Bluff. That's the Dewberry office desk, she said. Old Carl Dewberry sat at that desk 40 years and never once let a soul go in that bottom drawer. His own boys didn't know what was in it. I asked him once, plain, what he kept locked up so careful, and he looked at me like I'd reached into his coffin. She shook her head. Whatever's in there, Silas Penhallow, it weighed on that man his whole life. You watch yourself with it. Then she patted the truck fender twice with her flat old hand and made her slow way back to the wagons, and Silas stood looking after her. And looking at the desk, and feeling the first cold weight of the thing settle on him before he had ever turned the lock. He took it home to the small white house on the edge of Cedar Bluff where he had lived alone since his wife Verna passed in the hard winter of 1977. He set the desk in the front room under the window and made himself coffee and sat down to study it before he touched it. The way he studied everything. The way you read a machine before you put a wrench to it. The rolltop he freed easily, easing the dried tambour with a candle stub rubbed along the slats, and it ran up smooth and showed him cubbyholes empty except for dust and a dead wasp and a railroad pencil. It was the bottom drawer he wanted. The lock was a simple cabinet lock, brass, frozen with verdigris, and Silas did not force it. He took out his grandfather's knife and a hatpin he kept for such work, and he sat by the window in the good light, and he picked it the way patience picks anything, by feel, by waiting, until late in the afternoon the bolt turned over with a small green grind and slid back. It had taken him most of a day, and the truth was, he was in no hurry for it to end. The house was a quiet place now. Verna had been a great one for talk, had filled 40 years of rooms with it, and when she died, the quiet had come down over the place like snow and never quite melted off. Silas had found that the only cure for it was work, and good work was getting harder to come by for a man his age in a county where the young fellows had all the tools now and half the patience. So he had taken his time with the lock the way a hungry man takes his time with the last good meal, talking low to it as he worked, the way Verna used to laugh at him for talking to the machines, telling it there was no call to be stubborn, that they would get there together if it would only meet him part way. When the bolt finally gave, he sat back and let out a breath, and for a moment. Before he opened it, he was almost sorry, the way you were sorry to finish a thing that gave your hands something to do. The drawer was full of paper. It had been packed tight and dry, and it had kept. There were letters in their envelopes tied with string, and a small canvas sack heavy in his hand, and an oilcloth packet folded flat. Silas opened the sack first and poured out a slow stream of silver dollars onto the desktop. Morgan dollars and Peace dollars, the newest of them 1934, more than 100 of them, a small fortune in a poor place hidden away and forgotten. But it was the oilcloth packet that stopped him, because folded inside it was a land deed, and the deed was not Dewberry land. It was the title to a quarter section out on the West Tableland, and the name on it was Mercer, Thomas and Ada Mercer, and folded with it were the letters, and Silas read them by the window as the light went red and then gray, and what he read sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. The Mercers had homesteaded that quarter section in the 80s of the last century and proved it up and farmed it through 3 generations, and in the worst year of the Dust Bowl in 1934, with the wheat blown out and the cattle dead and the dust standing in drifts against the fence, Thomas Mercer had died of the dust pneumonia that took so many men that decade, and left his widow Ada with 3 children and a note at the bank. The banker's name was Vernon Tate. The letters were Ada Mercer's, copies kept in her own hand, and Vernon Tate's, the real ones, and together they told a thing that no court had ever heard. Tate had told the widow her husband had signed a second note she knew nothing of, a note that put the land up against a debt twice what they owed, and when she could not pay it, he had foreclosed and taken the quarter section for the bank and sold it within the year to a man named Dewberry. Ada Mercer had sworn the second note was a forgery, that her husband could barely write his own name, and she was right, and the proof was in her hand in that drawer, where Dewberry had locked it away. For somewhere along the line, a Dewberry had come to know the truth, had come into possession of Ada's letters and Tate's, had learned the land under his own plow had been taken from a widow by a forged name, and had not been able to give it back, and had not been able to live with telling it, and so had locked it in a drawer with a sack of silver dollars that was likely the price of his silence or the salve for his conscience, and had carried it to his grave, and his children had sold it rather than open it. Silas sat in the dark a long time. He had known hard men, and he had known the Dust Bowl as a young man, and he had buried more than one neighbor who lost everything in those years and never got it back. He was not a man given to anger. But he was a man who believed that a wrong written down was a wrong that could still be set right, even 50 years late, because the truth does not rot the way wood and iron rot. It keeps. That was the whole reason a man wrote anything down. He had been 20 years old himself in 1934, hiring out wherever there was work, and he remembered those years the way a man remembers a sickness, in the body before the mind. He remembered the dusters coming up black on the horizon at noon, and the chickens going to roost in the dark of midday, and the dirt sifting in around the windows no matter how a man stuffed the cracks, the grit in the bread and in the teeth and in the bedclothes. He remembered families loading what they could onto a truck and the rest left standing in the yard for the bank. And he remembered that the banks in those years had been the only ones with money and the only ones with patience that ran the wrong direction, patient to wait for a man to fail so the paper could be called. He had not known the Mercers, but he had known a dozen families just like them, and reading Ada Mercer's letters by his window in the dark, he was reading all of them. Every widow and every called note and every quarter section that passed from the people who had broken it to the people who had only money, and the old slow anger of it came up in him cold and clear, 50 years banked and not gone out. He could have kept the silver. No one living knew it was there. He could have sold the deed as a curiosity, the way Lyle Cruz would have. A Dust Bowl document for a collector, $65 turned into $600. Silas Penhallow didn't either. He had never in his life taken a thing that was not his, and he did not intend to begin at 69. He spent that spring and summer finding the Mercers. Ada had moved her children to Grand Island and taken in washing and outlived her name being cleared by 40 years, dying in 1968. But her children had children, and her grandson, a man named Curtis Mercer, taught high school history not 60 miles away in Kearney, and had grown up on the story of the stolen land the way other families grow up on stories of the war, half believed, never proved, a bitterness handed down without evidence to hang it on. When Silas Penhallow drove to Kearney and laid Ada's letters and the forged note and the original deed out on Curtis Mercer's kitchen table, the man put his face in his hands and wept, because the thing his grandmother had sworn to her death and no one had believed was true after all, and here it was in her own hand, proved it had not been simple to find him. Silas was no detective, only a patient man, and he went about it the way he went about a seized engine, one bolt at a time. He started at the courthouse with the old plat books and traced the court of section back through its owners to the year it changed hands in 1934, and there was Vernon Tate's bank as to seller and Carl Dewberry as the buyer, plain as day, a year after the foreclosure. He took Ada Mercer's name to the county newspaper's morgue and found her husband's death notice from the dust pneumonia spring, and from there to the church rolls, and from the church rolls to a cousin in town who remembered the family had gone to Grand Island, and from Grand Island by telephone calls he made standing in his kitchen with his reading glasses on and a county directory open, to a great niece who knew that Ada's grandson taught school over in Kearney. It took Silas the better part of 4 months of driving and phoning and writing letters in his spidery hand, and every step of it he could have stopped and no one would have known, and at every step he went on, because a thing started is a thing finished. And because the dead widow's truth had waited 50 years in the dark, and the least he could do was not make it wait a day longer than his old legs required. The land could not be given back. It had passed through 4 owners, and the law had long since closed over it. But the truth could be given back, and Silas Penhallow understood that the truth was the thing that had been stolen, more than the dirt. He gave the Mercer family the deed and the letters and every silver dollar over Curtis Mercer's protests, because the silver had been hidden by a guilty conscience and belonged, Silas said, to the people that conscience had wronged. And he sat with Curtis Mercer and a woman from the County Historical Society and helped set the whole record down, dated and sourced and witnessed, so that it could never again be only a family story. The Cedar Bluff Historical Society put the deed and a copy of the forged note on display that winter with the true account beside it, and the name of Vernon Tate was set down at last for what he had done, 50 years after he had died respectable and rich, and the name of Ada Mercer was set down for what she had endured and sworn and been right about all along. They held a small gathering for it on a cold, clear evening in the Historical Society's 2 front rooms, and more people came than anyone expected. Old farm families came, the ones who remembered the Dust Bowl years in their bones, who had lost places of their own to notes they could not pay and banks that did not bend, and they stood before the glass and read Ada Mercer's small, even hand and her sworn words that no one had believed, and Silas watched a good many of them go quiet in the way men go quiet when a thing they'd carried alone turns out to have been carried by others too. Curtis Mercer stood up and tried to thank the room and could not finish, and his daughter, a girl in high school, finished it for him, and said her great-great-grandmother had told the truth her whole life and died with no one believing her, and that the worst thing that can happen to an honest person is to be right and not believed. And that, tonight, 50 years too late and better than never, her grandmother was believed. Hetty Lund was there in her good coat, leaning on her cane, and when it was over she found Silas by the door and looked up at him with her sharp old eyes. "I told you it weighed on Carl Dewberry his whole life," she said. "Now you know why he couldn't open the drawer. And now you know why you could." And she patted his arm and made her slow way out into the cold. A reporter from the county paper asked Silas why a man would give away a fortune in old silver to strangers over a thing that happened before he was grown. "Wasn't my silver," Silas said. "Wasn't ever going to be. A man finds the truth in a drawer. The truth's not his to keep. It's just his to carry to the people it belongs to." He turned his hat in his long hands. "Land you can steal, I've seen it done. But a thing written true and kept dry in a drawer that you can only hide, and what's hid long enough finds a patient hand to open it." He drove home to Cedar Bluff in the early dark with the empty desk riding in the bed, and he meant to fix the timbre proper and oil the runners and use it himself. Because a desk was made for keeping things, and this one had kept the most important thing of all for half a century, until somebody came along with the patience to read it. What is buried is not the same as what is gone. The wind takes the topsoil, and the years take the witnesses, but the truth written down by a wronged hand waits in the dark as long as it has to. For someone slow enough and honest enough to turn the lock. So I'll leave it with you the way Silas left it. If you had stood on that windy section line and seen only a broken desk with a drawer that wouldn't open, would you have paid the $65 and spent the year carrying a dead widow's truth back to her grandchildren? Or would you have laughed with the loud man in the ostrich boots and walked on past, never knowing a stolen homestead was waiting in the dark to finally be named?